Nice to see you.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you too.
Good morning, Charlene. It's so lovely to see you finally and have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm Reena Chaturvedi and I'm one of the directors of one of the campuses in Jaipur.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too.
Thank you for organizing this.
Oh,
I guess
all
it's
thanks to Keith.
for you.
It's an honor for us to have you here, and we can't thank Keith enough be able, to organize this for our students, because this is a great way of learning, hearing it from the masters themselves, and you're there on ground zero, and
the masters.
It's not the same as what we study in books, and this is really going to be a great insight for all of us. So we're still waiting for a few more students to join in. They're finishing with the earlier class, and they'll be here in the next couple of minutes. We start exactly at 10:30. I think we're there, are we?
I think
Yes,
we're there.
We'll 2 or 3 minutes, if it's okay with you.
Yeah,
we have almost 200 students here. We're expecting a few hundred more. Yes, this is all the campuses. We have 8 campuses across India. And our third year students, they're the final year. They will be joining us very, very shortly.
Perfect.
Thank you, Charlene, for getting up so early. But I know that you have a 20-month-old, so you're probably getting up fairly early anyway. You've been up for a couple of hours, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, actually, she sleeps pretty well. But it's more the big day that is today, because today is the first day of harvest. So anywhere we're all yes, so that's just it's just by chance that we're talking today. But in a couple of minutes, it will be like a beehive at the estate, because it's very exciting when we harvest for the first day. So yeah. So you'll see my father right before he visits the first parcel being harvested. So that's exciting.
Oh, well, this is a very auspicious day to do this. Then I'm excited that we have it, because I was reading a little bit about the days when they were going to announce them, but I didn't see that. But that's an interesting thing, I think, for the students to understand that in Champagne it's quite different than most other wine regions when it comes to harvest.
Yes, in many different ways. What's even more different this year is that we have a very, very early harvest, almost by a month earlier than it usually is. So it's quite unusual for us to harvest mid-August, and it's becoming more and more often the past 10 years that we have to kind of adjust and be ready in late August to harvest because of the heat.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. It's happening in Champagne. So I guess the organization, as you just mentioned, said they would declare the harvest, but because of the dog days we had in early August, we didn't expect that to happen for 2 weeks. So the organizations had to announce the date of harvest earlier than what we expected, even in July. So that's a whole kind of system that we have to adjust.
Yeah, that's because it is early. I was thinking that's because we're just just past the 15th, so it's very early for.
Yeah.
When was it last year? What date was it last year?
Last year was early too, but it was early September, so September 1st or 2nd, which is already early. About 20 years ago, the common thing to do was to harvest in September 20th, and it would last until beginning of October, and now it's beginning of August, late August, and beginning of September, because it's quite unbelievable. It's when I left my home this morning at 6:15, it was over 20. Which is unseen in Champagne. We're not in India. It's really something that usually we have cool nights, but we're starting to even have warm nights, which might be a problem for levels of acidity in the long run, because if we don't have differences of temperature, it might, in the long term, influence the levels of acidity of Champagne, which would be too bad, because acidity is really important in Champagne. But I'm
Yeah,
maybe talking too much on that now. So
no, that's fine. Are we, are we ready to start?
Yes, we are. I think we have
Okay.
a good number. There are lots of them joining on Facebook Live too. So I think we're ready to go. Good morning, dear students. This is Reena Chaturvedi from Jaipur. We were so pleased to have with us Mr. Keith Edgar, and he has with him today Miss Charlene. Charlene is representing her family, vineyards, which have been in the business of champagne making for over 2 centuries, not even decades, 2 centuries, which they started in 1808. She's the 8th generation, and her 9th generation is all set to start working on the vineyards soon. A couple of decades, yes, but then yes, she's going to be there. She's a graduate from the Sorbonne in humanities, and then went on to do her MBA from Stockholm, Sweden. Is a level 3 WSET, and is a spirit lover. Has worked with Diageo and the French marketing team promoting their premium single malt and Scotch whiskey. She now looks after the sales development of the family estate, and it's really wonderful to hear all the insights from her, what we're hearing right now. She brings with her in her work a lot of passion about the champagne that they have. She works with her father, her brothers, and her grandfather. So there's 3 generations right now working on the vineyards, getting us the best champagne. Thank you, Charlene. It's really early, and I know it's going to be a very busy day for you because you are starting your harvest season today. Thank you so much for coming here and giving us, our students, some lovely insight on champagne manufacturing. So it's over to you, Keith and Charlene.
thank you.
Yes, Charlene, again, thank you very much for joining us. And I must go, cheers. I actually was going to do a quick little session on how to open a bottle of champagne because it's a little more complicated than a bottle of wine, but I couldn't wait, so I opened it already. But here is
Yes, cheers. Well, we can do this later if you want. I can grab an
yeah, that would be
later
good.
a bottle, and then I'll do it in front of you.
Yeah. I was just waiting, and I thought, no, I just can't. It's like having something in front of me that I can't touch it. I guess I'm like the but yes, so cheers. It's quite, this is a fairly recent bottle for you, isn't it? It's a little bit different, the bottle.
Yes. So yeah, it's a bottle we designed. It's Drapty exclusive, if I can say. We reduced the weight, so it's 15% lighter than the bottle of champagne. A bottle of champagne is heavy because of the pressure it has to hold. So it was an environmental aspect we wanted to tackle to reduce the impact of when it's exported, to have a lighter bottle. It's also darker, so it protects from the UV better, especially when it sits on the shelf of a restaurant or of a retailer. Sometimes it affects the wine because the UV rays go inside. So it's, if you notice, it's a darker bottle than the normal green champagne bottle. And it also has a narrow neck, so it protects from oxidation. Not to go too much into details, but we have wines that are very low in sulfur, in sulfite, which is a preservative. If you use less sulfur, you have to do anything you can to protect the wine from being in contact with the air and risking oxidation. So if you notice, also the neck is narrower than a regular bottle of champagne.
Yeah, and it has a really good feel, which is, as a sommelier, and just that, the feel of the bottle is really nice. It just has a nice. I didn't really notice the weight. I just it feels substantial in the hand. So it's a very sexy bottle. It's very nice. So please, you are 8th generation in the family, and that is quite a feat to be able to maintain a family business like that. If you could just give our students a little bit of the history on how it all started, we'd really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the story, if I can make it short, because it's a long story, it dates back from the 1100s. So 800 years ago, a monk from a very famous nearby abbey in Burgundy, which is the Abbaye de Cîteaux, settled in Champagne. He's called Saint Bernard, and he's the father of all the Bernardins, which was a very famous Cistercian order of monks. So what he did, he left from Burgundy, settled in Champagne, settled 10 kilometers away from where we are, and he founded his own abbey. From Burgundy, he brought the Pinot Noir. So he's really someone important in our history, because we'll talk about Pinot Noir later. It's one of the 7 varietals in Champagne, and it's a varietal we still use today because it's the heritage. It's his heritage. So he settled in Champagne, and he built 13 small cellars around his abbey where he was aging the wines, and we own one of these today. There's only 2 left because over 800 centuries. 8 centuries there are, some of them were destroyed, most of them were destroyed. And if you visit Champagne, all of you can visit our very, very old cellars. So we kept the tradition of Pinot Noir from that story. And then my family settled in this region about 400 years ago. They did different jobs. Before they were drapers, because my name is Drapier, and we were trading textiles in the Middle Ages. So we're a very local family, because the Champagne region was very famous for trading, actually from the Silk Road up to the Northern Europe. So that's for the side story. So we're really, really local. And then 200 years ago, they started farming grapes. So we were officially funded in 1808, and I'm officially, as Rina said, the 8th generation. So they started farming grapes, and really our tradition is a tradition of growers, so farmers of grapes, which is important. Maybe I can talk a little bit about that later, because Champagne is quite different. It's the structure between the négociants, so the very, very large brands would do mainly buying grapes, and also the very small growers that are farming the grapes. And we are somewhere in between, which is kind of unusual in Champagne. So we farm our own grapes, but we also sell them, sell them in the shape of champagne. So anyway, we started in 1808 as farmers, and then it's more the generations of my grandparents after the war, Second World War. They started to say, "Wow, we have a great terroir here in the Aube." So geography is very important in our history too, because Champagne is quite a widespread region, and we are in the furthest southern corner of Champagne, which is kind of far from the epicenter of the heart of Champagne. So my grandparents had to really fight to start making their own champagne, and because it was a region that was left to farmers, where the power, the money was really in the house and Epernay. So they were really pioneer and kind of poor, really poor farmers, and said, we have a great terroir here in Urville, and we are going to make our own champagne. So that was 70 years ago. And so my grandfather today, he's 94, and as mentioned, he's still in the company. He's still involved with us, and he can share all his experience with harvest and vineyards from the early 50s. So that's quite incredible to have this knowledge today. And my father joined in the late 70s, and he did his winemaking studies in Beaune, so in Burgundy, and where he learned a lot from making still wine. And he brought all of this knowledge to Urville in the 80s, and really focused in making quite unusual champagne. We'll talk about the Carte d'Or, but also the Brut Nature. So we have a very big focus on Pinot Noir and on low sugar champagne. So that's, maybe I can talk about that when we go, when we talk about the champagne method. Anyway, and now it's us. So it's my two brothers and I. My two brothers are both involved with more production, and I'm more involved in sales today, which is a great family adventure. 6 of us are working in the family vineyard. So we're about 45 people working in the company now, and we're one of the very few champagne producers that still own 100% of our company, but also manage it, because some of the champagne family owned houses are now run by other people. So very much involved in the everyday operations, and we will keep, I think, this tradition of my grandparents being pioneers. So we have a lot of new experiments coming up in the next decades. So that's really exciting. Champagne is a wine of very long term. So what we're doing today, we're doing it for the next generation. So the family aspect is really important in how we deal with the various investments, how we farm the grapes. This is a vision we have for the next 50 years. So that's quite interesting. And we have to run it differently than a normal company, if I can say that. Sorry, this was again a very long answer to
no,
your.
No. It's a long story, and it's a very complex story. And I don't know if our students realize that in the champagne business, I think it's about 2/3 of all champagne that is produced in the Champagne region is produced by corporations. LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. And 80% of all champagne that is exported outside of France is all done through these major corporations. And they all originally were family-run houses, but they were just slowly bought up. And I've always found really in any business that a family-run company is always, I feel that whatever they produce just has more personality and more quality than one that's potentially done by a corporation, because there's not the same heart there. And I know there's certain things that you do that don't necessarily make financial sense, but make common sense. I know you're the first carbon neutral and organic champagne house in all of Champagne. Is that still the case? Are you still the only ones?
Yeah, we're still the only winery in France that has achieved a carbon neutral footprint. And we're expanding what we're farming organically, even though that's quite a challenge in Champagne because of the conditions, the weather conditions we have here. But yeah, and we want to even push further because we want to be carbon positive. So we're going to produce more energy actually than we use. So that's we're trying to do things that make, as you just said, that make sense for us, and not to see the vineyards only in the process, because as you may know, in the wine we talk about organic wines or regular wines, but we tend to forget all of the other aspects in champagne making, or in having a lower impact on the environment. So my father a long time ago tried to have a very holistic approach on what we should do in terms of environmental projects. So that's quite innovative. Yeah.
No, I think that's amazing that happens, because I know it's in the wine business, not just in Champagne but around the world. These corporations are just buying more and more of these smaller wineries, and it makes sense from a fiscal aspect, because they could have one company marketing and selling and distributing 50 labels, where having one company to do all of that, because you're represented in most of the countries around the world, which is quite a feat, considering you're very large for an independent producer, but you're small compared to, what is it? Are you about 3 million bottles?
No, 1.7 million bottles.
Yeah. Oh, 1.7. Okay, I thought
around 1.7 million bottles. Which is at the same time, you just said it's small but big at the same time, but it's much smaller than LVMH. Of course, LVMH is over, if you combine all of their brands, is over 100 million. So it's a different story. But yes, we cannot scale up. So everything we do has to be small, but at the same time, we, as you just said, we're represented in 110 countries. So we have a very widespread distribution, all of them in niche markets, because we focus in restaurants mostly, or independent retailers. So there is, as I could say, there is probably a space for us in many countries, because there are wine lovers in many countries, which is why we're widespread. But because we don't do huge marketing investment, there's not a country where you will see us with, advertisement and everywhere in stores. We will remain quite discreet, but in many countries. So I guess that's how we achieved also independency. And in times like these, for example, it's a strength, because it was a lot of work at the beginning, and it's still a lot of work. We have to visit different countries, and we have many different partners. But that way we don't rely on one single huge market. And if we lose that market, then we will be endangered, which is important to be stable as a family business. So, and in times like COVID-19, it's important to have also this stability for us, so we could keep going and keep thinking about the future. So yeah, that's important.
Yeah, and I know you're really committed to the India market as well. You've been there for quite a number of years, and I believe you're number 3, considering you only produce 0.5% of the champagne that's produced in Champagne. You're number 3 in sales in all of India, and your father is so generous with his time, because I know we've done a number of events, and he's always come over, and again, you may not have big billboards everywhere, but you certainly have your father, who is a powerhouse when it comes to promoting his brand. He's just the consummate ambassador for a product like champagne. He's just
and he loves India too, so this helps.
Super. So all of you students out there, when you become F&B directors in all those hotels, make sure that you're serving Drapier champagne at the Sunday brunch. I was actually I fly Qatar Airlines a lot whenever I fly to India, and there was about a year there that I was able to drink your rosé on the flight. How important is that to get a label on an airline like that, as far as sales, but then just also visibility?
Well, it's tough to get in. It's all made by blind tasting, so it's a very long process, and airlines like Qatar are really demanding on the quality of the product. Maybe you've noticed they have 2 different, even in business class, they serve 2 different champagne.
I love that.
So they have a choice. So it's quite tough to get in, and then it becomes important for us, because it brings us visibility, and as we don't really spend any marketing fees, having our champagne tasted is the most important thing we could do, because all our focus is on the quality of champagne. So having many people from around the world discovering our champagne through airlines is also something quite important for us. So we don't do huge volumes, because we don't have them. So we have to select with whom, which airlines we work. For example, we weren't able to work with Air France for a long time, because Air France volume was so big they would have used a third of our production in a certain category. So we're going to work with the Japan Airlines, for example, or a few of them, like in first class too, where they serve only prestige cuvée. So it's also a way to have our prestige cuvée discovered. But obviously these days it's also we've lost all our airline sales. Luckily, as I just mentioned, because we have quite an even and widespread distributions, we're able to find that in other domestic markets. But it might become a problem for champagne that all of those airline sales will not be made this year, because obviously planes are not flying, or if they are, they're sometimes not even serving champagne or not serving alcohol. So we'll see how that goes in 2021. Yeah. I saw questions about champagne making. Do you want me to talk about that now?
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll get to the students' questions at the end, but we are actually, that's a perfect time to shift to production of champagne. And I think as today is the first day of harvest, that's maybe a good place to start.
Yes.
And how that works, so the students can understand.
Yes. So harvest in Champagne, obviously most important time of the year for us. It's where we how can I say that? So our efforts are being awarded at this time. So it's a very exciting time. It's very intense. It only lasts 10 days. Some of the other wine region, it spreads because they have different varietals with different ripening periods. In Champagne, it's all concentrated. So starting with the most important thing, in Champagne, harvest is only manual. So no machines being used in Champagne, which is also not the case in all Champagne, in all wine regions. So only manual, it helps keeping the grapes healthy, and also very important,
I think we may have lost Charlene there. Let's wait a moment as she gets back. Yeah, as she was mentioning, it's the there's an association within Champagne, within the Champagne growers, or the region, that when they can harvest. In other areas, they will actually harvest the grape when the grapes are ripe. For example, in Chianti, the particular wineries can choose when they want to pick their grapes, and they'll typically pick their grapes when they are ripe. But in Champagne, they actually will designate a day that all Champagne houses can start picking. So that's quite something. And then they're only allowed 10 days to do it. So it's and again, there's a lot of in Champagne, there's a lot of rules and regulations that are there that sort of dictate how right from when the grapes can start picking up until how the champagne is made, how the minimum amount of time that the wine has to age on the lees before it can be done, just all the way down to a minimum price that champagne must be sold for. So there's a lot of things that goes on in Champagne that you just don't see in other areas at all. So it's a bit of a challenge. There's a bit of history behind the reasons of doing it, but it's also a little bit about trying to maintain these quality standards. And I was just talking about the rules and regulations that Champagne has about when you can pick and all that sort of stuff. So please continue on where you were.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But yeah, where was I? So yeah, very strict regulation. They decide on the dates of harvest, or at least they give you a time frame. Yeah. And you have to respect this time frame to start harvesting. And we usually, the first harvesters there's only maybe 3 weeks between the first harvesters until the last harvesters. So we start picking the grapes by hand, and then we start pressing them. So it has to be a very short time between the picking and the press to protect the grapes. So because I was talking about the varietals. So varietals, Pinot Noir and Meunier, for example, are two black varietals, meaning, at least in Champagne, they have a black skin, but a white flesh. So for example, if you were to use machine harvesting, the dark skin would be in contact with the white flesh and would then stain, and we will end up having sort of a rosé wine in the end. So one of the reasons why it's manual is that we have to have very clean grapes that are not crushed in cases or crushed by the machine. So in terms of plantation, there is in Champagne approximately a third of each of those main varietals. Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Meunier. So then the grape is being crushed, and we end up with grape juice, and the grape juice goes through alcoholic fermentation. So any wine goes through alcoholic fermentation. Then we have another fermentation in Champagne, and in a few other wine regions that is called malolactic fermentation. I might not go too deep into this, but if I can sum it up, it helps lowering the levels of acidity. Not really, but the acidity is softer after a malolactic fermentation. And after that, we have what we call in Champagne a vin clair, which literally means a clear wine that has no bubble. So we will put the vin clair with some yeast and some sugar in the bottle. It's what we call the bottling. And during this process, the wine will start fermenting because the yeast will eat the sugar, and by eating the sugar it will turn it into carbon dioxide, and this is what we call prise de mousse. So it's this beginning of the effervescence of champagne. So this is the champagne process that's been invented in Champagne and that's being reproduced now in different parts of the world as what is called méthode traditionnelle, meaning the traditional method of fermenting in the bottle. Some other sparkling wines are not made this way, Prosecco, for example, but usually quality, Champagne and quality sparkling wines are completely inspired by the Champagne method. So at this time you have sparkling wine that will need to age, because you have very raw product. It's young and it needs to be aged in order to get more complexity. So the AOC, the appellation that Keith just mentioned, also regulates aging in the bottle. So to sell a bottle of of champagne, it's a minimum 15 months. That's of aging. And it's aged with the yeast. So going back to the process, it still has yeast in the bottle because this yeast is now dead. It's done its job, it's eaten the sugar, and it transforms into a sort of dust that settles at the bottom of the bottle, which is why we age them horizontally. So we have thousands, if not millions. For example, at Drapi, we have 5 million bottles aging in our cellars for different periods of time, depending if we want it to be a prestige cuvée, so vintage, or if we want it to be a regular cuvée. And then we start whenever we want to use it and release it on the market. So when we want to do that, it will have to go through 3 different steps. That's why champagne is so complex. So you have a horizontal bottle with yeast at the bottom, and if you want to drink that, you don't want to eat the yeast. It's literally eating. It's very it's dusty and solid. So we will go through the process of riddling. So maybe you've seen those riddling racks, as they're called in Champagne. They're called pupitres, where we turn the bottle in order to have the yeast slowly sliding down to the neck of the bottle. Most of it today is done with machines that are turning the bottle, but there's still a couple of bottles riddled by hand. Our Prestige Cuvée, for example, the Grand Cendré is riddled by hand. And what we want is to have this yeast sliding and being stuck at the neck of the bottle. And now the bottles are on their neck. So they're vertical with the bottom up. And this way we can trap the yeast by freezing the very end of the neck, and the yeast will be trapped in a sort of an ice cube. And when we open the bottle, it's a process we call dégorgement. The yeast will be trapped in that ice cube and will just pop, and then we will have a clear champagne. It's a very important process in Champagne, the disgorgement. And actually, you see Champagne specialists talking a lot about disgorgement, when it was disgorged, for example. And after the disgorgement, so the last step is the addition of sugar that we call in Champagne dosage, which is another term that you will hear often amongst Champagne specialists. Most of Champagne have added sugar, which is something that people might not know. It's probably the only wine that receives a small amount of sugar at the very end of the process. And this level of sugar, this amount of sugar will determine how sweet is the champagne. And we talk about levels of sweetness in terms of brut. Brut is a normal sweetness. And then we have sweeter champagne, like demi-sec, and we have drier champagne, like extra brut or brut zero, meaning there is no addition of sugar. And only now you can put the cork in and the cage and release it on the market. So it's quite a complex process, which also explains the price, because it's not only the price of the grape, which is true, it's very high in Champagne, but also the process in itself that is lengthy, and the aging, and yeah, all the sensitive step that implies making champagne. Sorry, was this clear?
Yes, absolutely. That was very, very good. And I always find it interesting that in making champagne, it becomes very, very complicated when you're doing your, for example, the Coteau, or you're doing your brut, or your house style, your house champagne, where you're, even though the harvest is different year after year after year, you're selling a brand that should, when the customer drinks it year after year after year, it should taste exactly the same. So if you could talk a little bit about how you even out the vintages.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Thank you, Keith.
No,
yeah, Champagne has a very unique functioning regarding vintages too. As you noticed, or as Keith has his bottle of Carte d'Or on the table, there is no year mentioned on the label. There is no vintage mentioned on the label. The reason is that there is several years blend in this bottle. So the innovation in Champagne a long time ago was to say, we are going to keep reserve wine. So reserve wine is a wine that is being produced from grapes from previous years. So let's say we are in 2019. We're going now to harvest 2020, sorry. 2020 is so weird that I keep talking about 2019. But we actually still have wines from previous years that are being saved in our tanks or wooden barrels. And we use these in order to even a quality or just a style. It's not necessarily a term of quality, but sometimes it's also looking for more depth in finding a blend between old vintages and more recent vintages. We're going to look for the freshness of a more recent vintage and the complexity of a reserve wine. So wine that's been aged sometimes for over 10 years. And it's still in the state of a still wine. So it's not a champagne. And these wines are usually in March being blended in and to find our house style. So it's maybe more, how can I say that? Large houses usually have a very even style. So because they do most of their buying, so they do own some vines, don't get me wrong, but most of what they need, they actually have to buy. So they have to cope with very, very different juices, very from different terroirs, and they blend that, and that's usually why they have very even, because when you blend very different, you end up with a sort of a compromise. At Drapier, the difference is that we own 60 hectares and we farm over 100 hectares, which is quite a lot for a small house, and we have control over our supply, and we usually accept because there's one single terroir here where we are, that there is a little bit more differences over the years. And we have customers that are ready to accept that the house style might not be as even or that much of a compromise as Moët et Chandon, for example. I didn't want to mention anyone, but if there was to compare, because we have a vintage effect, because our so people are usually ready to accept that there is a change in color, for example, in our champagnes, or that this specific year may affect a little bit. But this is also the only way you can have maybe a little bit more identity in your wine, is that because we don't blend it from different places and we accept that there is an identity of vintage and there is an identity of terroir. And the more specific the cuvée is, the more it will show. So maybe the carte d'or in our range is the one that has a house style that is more constant. And then we have different cuvées that really even more show the characteristics of our terroir and our years, our vintages. And the purpose of a vintage champagne, so really the labels that you will see on the shelf that has a year written on it, is because this specific year was selected for its greatness usually, and this champagne that has a year on it is usually more expensive, and it has gone through a longer aging. Most houses would release their champagne at say 10 years for prestige cuvée after the grapes were picked. So this is really when people sometimes forget how long we have to see when we talk about champagne. We're not like a wine that we're going to release next year. We're making a wine sometimes that we're going to release in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years.
Super. Yeah, there is, because the vast majority of champagne that is produced and sold is non-vintage. So it is coming from a blend of different years. So we hear a lot of talk about the prestige cuvées that all the different champagne houses produce. I believe Grand Cendré is your prestige cuvée, which I have had the fortune to drink it a few times, and it's quite lovely. How would you explain to the students the production methods and potentially the quality level of the Grand Cendré versus the Coteau?
Yeah, so it starts in the vines always. The story begins in the vines, where, for example, the Grand Cendré that I'll show you in a couple of minutes is from a single parcel. So no mistake allowed in the single vineyards. When blending different parcels allow you some kind of, oh, okay, this parcels went wrong. I'm going to get the grapes from another parcel, which is something you cannot do when you're talking about single terroir, single vineyard champagne. And the idea is really to express the terroir of this parcel, which is a little bit more complex in terms of geology than the rest of our estates. So, and it's farmed organically. Grand Cendré is organic, so which is more also more expensive and more difficult than normal farming. Even though we don't do normal farming, there's no pesticide, no herbicide used in our vineyards. So even the one that is not accredited organic is very sustainable. And then picking the grapes and making the normal fermentation. But there is also a difference when it ages. So something that I didn't mention because I didn't want you to be too much confused, but the step between making a still wine and bottling can sometimes be longer than in a non-vintage champagne. And in the case of Grand Cendré, we age the still wine partly in oak barrels before putting the wine in a bottle. And this way it will get a little bit more complexity and oxidation through the aging in oak barrels. In Champagne, we don't really have very small oak barrels like you will see in Burgundy or Bordeaux. We usually use very large oak foudre. They are 5,000 liters approximately. This way we don't have too much oxidation on the wine, but we're looking for a bit more complexity. So that's another step that's added to the Grand Cendré. And then the bottle ages for much longer than normal champagne. Ages, for example, we're just starting to release 2010. So it's really 10 years after harvest. And the last step would be riddling, which is always done by hand with the Grand Cendré, because the shape of the bottle, and I'll pick one for you, is different than a normal champagne bottle. So these are, for example, the few steps that make a prestige cuvée different than a non-vintage cuvée.
Yeah, there's a term, students. There's a term called autolysis, and that is basically where the extended period of time that we leave the yeast, the lees in the bottle. It's basically a flavoring component, and you just get much more complexity. And I know I was very fortunate to come to your winery. I don't know how many years ago you had the big party, and you were pulling some champagne out of the cellar that had been 30 years on the lees, and the complexity and it's such a beautiful experience to be able to taste these champagnes that have had that much time and exposure to the lees. So students, study hard, practice well, and you can experience these wines as well. Before we get to the questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the grapes that are used in champagne. I think 99.7% of the grapes used are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. But you actually grow and use all 7 of the grapes, which in addition are Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Arbane, and Petit Meunier. Meunier. I'll let you, if you could just talk a little bit about what each of these grapes kind of brings to the blend.
Yeah, I'll start with the Pinot Gris, because it's actually what we're harvesting today. Pinot Gris is what we call Fromenteau here. It's the local name of the Pinot Gris. Maybe some of you have studied Pinot Gris in Alsace. I'm not talking about Pinot Grigio in Italy, because it's a slightly different varietal than the Pinot Gris in Alsace. But we farm some Pinot Gris, which is why we're harvesting it today. It's a very not early ripening, but quite low acidity and high sugar varietal with a lot of exotic flavors. But we really have to harvest it today, otherwise it will really lack acidity to make champagne. So Fromenteau is a beautiful gray varietal that brings exotic flavor to champagne. And we replanted it in 2013, I believe, 7 years ago. And we started making the first experiment of 100% Fromenteau champagne and 100% Fromenteau champagne still wine. So I don't want to confuse you, but we also make champagne, still wine from Champagne, which is a different AOC. It's an AOC called Coteau Champenois. And we had this idea of studying the varietal, the Fromenteau, in a sparkling version and in a still version. So that's why we're harvesting it today too, is to continue this experimentation on Fromenteau. That's for the Fromenteau. For the 3 other varietals, they're all white. So white flesh and white skin. If you don't know them, you might confuse them for Chardonnay, but they have different genetics and different aromas. The strangest one, and what is to us one of the most interesting, is the Arbane. It's a varietal that is endemic from the Aube, so from the southern part of Champagne, and it's a varietal that we don't really know. We don't know who are the parents. So maybe you've studied that most varietals have their parents. You can identify the father is a Gouais, the mother a Pinot, or I call them parents to simplify. But the Arbane, for example, the genetics are completely unknown. We believe it's a Roman varietal, so that's been brought by the Roman over 2,000 years ago. That is producing very, very green berries, small berries, high acidity. So it's interesting in the blend because it brings the structure when you have a varietal that has high acidity. So that's for the Arban. It's a pain to harvest because on a single bunch of grape, you may have berries that are different ripening stages. So we have to cherry pick the berries instead of picking the whole bunch. So it really is a pain, and it's one of the reasons why it's not being kept as a major champagne varietal. And Petit Méliès and Blanc Vrai, so Pinot Blanc, are two varietals that have very subtle character. It's nice. It brings a nice, as I say, subtle balance, a nice freshness. So it doesn't have the complexity of Chardonnay. It doesn't have necessarily the yields of Chardonnay. So these four varietals also, it's important to keep in mind that they were left on the side because the yields are much lower. So financially, they don't really make sense. So when my father took the decision to replant them over 20 years ago, it wasn't a very rational decision. It was more led by, oh, it's too bad. We're going to lose the diversity of our appellation if no one tries to replant them and keep them in the vineyards. So which is why we replanted them in the first place. And then came the idea of making a champagne out of it, because probably all of them had something to bring in the blend. And we started making the Quatuor, which means four in Latin, reference to the Roman roots of those varietals, in order to find how interesting those varietals can be in the light of the 21st century. Because back in the days, for example, they were all very, very hard to get ripe, except for the Fromenteau, which gets ripe easily. But the Arban and Petit Méliès and Blanc Vrai were hardly even ripe every year. But today, with what we're seeing in terms of climate change, we're seeing more interesting aromas in those varietals. And when we created the Quatuor, those four varietals actually, each of them brought something to the final wine, and it's probably one of the most sophisticated wine we produce out of very rustic and abandoned grapes. So the stretch is quite interesting between those varietals were bad and left, and we're making something modern and new out of the old heritage. So it's like growing heirloom tomatoes.
Yeah, which is what's in now. Is it the only tomatoes you're finding in the best restaurants are all heirloom tomatoes? There's not the other ones. So no, it's interesting because, and again, I think global warming is giving sort of new opportunities in wine, just because of, for example, as you said, in your particular terroir, you weren't able to get a lot of these grapes perfectly right. But now, because it is getting warmer, you're actually able to get them, and they're actually giving you more interesting flavors and complexities, which is something that I didn't know. So I'm glad we learned that. So super. So I think we'd like to go to some questions now from the students.
Can I just maybe I'll bring a bottle because you wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll do that and I'll be back in just a second.
If you could sort of get the questions organized, and then we can get to them as she brings a bottle.
Yes, there are a number of questions that are there, but I see she has answered a lot of these already while she was talking. So there is Shubham Sopti. She's already spoken about the grapes. So there's somebody who's asked, Tanish Keshavani has asked, is it possible to have some residual after degorgement? And if yes, how do you get it removed?
Typically with any residual yeast, that's what you say. Typically in disgorgement, that's the goal is to get all of it out. So if it doesn't, they typically could get it all out within one go when they do the disgorgement. They've been practicing. Okay, great. We have some
Before I move
champagne.
to the opening, I wanted to show you the bottle of the Grand Cendré that we just talked about, which is different shape, very old shape. I don't know if you see that. And you see also the year. And it's,
super.
Yeah. Sorry.
Fantastic.
Did I just interrupt you?
No. Someone had a question on disgorgement. If you didn't get everything, what do you do? But I think the process is pretty good that they're pretty much getting it 100% of the time, correct?
There is a more modern way of doing it today. When it was my grandparents' time, they had no freezing technology. So they would open the bottle by hand. It would consist in open the bottle very, very fast. And it's true that at that time we lost more champagne, and sometimes a little bit of yeast was left in the bottle, which was, they left the bottle aside. When today in the 70s, they invented this technology of freezing to make sure no yeast stays in the bottle.
Mm. So was there another question?
Yes, there's a question which says, what are the guidelines in your vineyards for the soil and feeding the grape vines while they're growing? You say you are organic. So what is it that you use to give a good grape?
So we actually don't, usually in Champagne at least, we don't necessarily feed the soil. The problem is more pesticide and herbicide in order to avoid competition at the root of the vines. Traditionally, many Champagne producers, or I'd say farmers, were spraying the soil in order to avoid any type of life, because to favor the growth of the vine. And this is something that that made the biodiversity less interesting. So what we're doing in organic vine is to allow herbs to be planted. Was that the question?
Yeah, no, it was just about.
Yeah, so it was, yes, it was.
Yeah. So, for example, in organic farming, we do control it, but we let the plants grow on the surface of the soil. And we would, for example, plow 1 row out of 2, 1 row out of 3, and leave the plants on 1 row out of 3, for example, in order to bring back biodiversity. Another thing was to spray pesticide, something that's very common to avoid bugs and flies and anything. But by doing that, there was it changed the ecosystem in Champagne. And now organic has to let the flies come back, let the butterflies come back so they can eat the bugs. It's the same story in many types of agriculture, is that in order to increase yields and production, everything that was not vines was, can I say it harshly, killed?
Yes.
And growing organically means accepting the biodiversity, and of course accepting that you might lose a little bit of yield, which is why financially organic farming doesn't make sense, in order to introduce diversity in the vine. So if one day you come to Champagne, you easily observe the very clean vines that have pesticides, and the ones next to that are not so clean but are still controlled. Don't get me wrong, it's not because you're growing organically that you're letting like the jungle grow. It actually requires more work because there is no chemicals and it's more manual work. So we have people in the vines just working with their hands in order to take away the weeds or something. So was that a good answer of your question to your question?
Yes, I think you've answered it all. You know, there are so many questions that have come in, but you have along the way when you were talking, you almost covered everything. But there's one last question that I also found interesting. With the first day, today being your first day of harvest, what do you predict the wine will be? A vintage or a non-vintage year?
It will be a vintage. We already know that. Some of the years is more difficult, but this year we know it will be a good year. It will. It's a warm year. It's true, but a very healthy year. So meaning no rain, no mushroom, no moist in the vineyard. So and enough. Maturity, ripeness, so it will be a vintage. It might not be a vintage that has high acidity, so it might not be a vintage for the next 35 years, but it might be a vintage really good to be tasted in 10, 15, 20 years.
So I think that answers a lot of our questions. Thank you so much, Charlene. Keith, would you have something more to say?
No, I think that was great. Charlene, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. There's many questions I can answer them writing if you need, but yeah, it's many questions.
No, I think most of them have been answered. Along the way, when you were talking about, you gave us such a detailed, account of what actually happens in your vineyard. Thank you so much, Charlene. Thank you really for taking out time on a very, very busy day for you. We wish you all the very best for the harvest season, and keep the bubbles rolling in. That's all we can say. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
we
Rina.
hope to be this
Thank
year.
you to all the students.
Cheers.
Students,
Cheers.
for Charlene from Drapier, making one of the best champagnes, which she talks about, which is 1.7 million bottles, which is a wonderful production. And we hope to come across some. I think I've seen a few bottles in India. Correct me if I'm wrong, Keith. Was it in a duty free, or did I see it in one of the shops? I'm not sure.
Everywhere.
But yes,
you'll see it everywhere.
Yes, so I think we should pick up a few bottles and have a few tasting. Hoping to be back in Europe soon, visiting your vineyards. Yes, and thank you once again, Charlene, and thank you, Keith, for making this possible, giving our students such lovely insights which no books can ever give. Thank you once again. So we're signing off now. Thank you, students. Keep learning. This is the best way that we can do it. And thanks once again. So bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Bye-bye.
it. Thank you. Bye-bye.